Call this Pima County Transportation Advisory Committee Subcommittee meeting to order. If we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, so we actually have 5 official members apparently to the subcommittee, and 4 of us are here, so we're waiting for Mr. Winchester. I guess he may be on his way. Sounds good. Let's move on to item 3 then. Subcommittee overview, Catherine?
Yeah, thank you all. Catherine Skinner, the Director of Transportation. First, I wanted to thank you because obviously you guys already commit a lot of time to the full Transportation Advisory Committee, and now we've added this subcommittee to your agenda, and we appreciate the time commitment to this. We think this is going to be a better environment to have some of these conversations and talk about how the program has grown and what we've accomplished and what we need to do to continue to be successful moving forward. So just a little overview. I know most all of you have been here since the beginning of the committee, but this all really started in terms of our 10-year program on November 5th, 2019, when Mr. Huckleberry sent a memo to the board embracing the pay-go and the commitment of funding both from the general funds, and then the department is contributing a significant amount of funding to get our roadways to a good condition. And so you've seen the success. I mean, I think we remember those meetings 3-4 years ago when it was standing room only, with the public concerned about when are we going to fix their roads, how are we going to do this, and again, thank you. We worked through the survey process, coming up with criteria, and we've effectively delivered that program. We're in our 4th year now, and we're doing a great job. The team is here, a lot of staff back at the office, working really hard. So our goal here is today is there's a lot of things that have changed in the last 4 years. We all know inflation has been huge, unexpected these past 2 years. There's also been a lot of material shortages, trucking shortages. A lot of those challenges have kind of gotten over that. They were very COVID related, but we're also prepared for those things to come up again. I think we have a little bit more uncertainty and confidence in just having product available when we need it. So the inflation, interest rates. So, the county sells certificates of participation. That's what's provided these 50 million slugs of funding the past 2 years and this year. But there's interest related to that. And with the huge increase in interest rates these last few months, really, it costs more to spend that money, and that's another thing we need to take into consideration, something we didn't consider when this program was being put together. We've learned a lot through delivering this much work, obviously, on how to streamline the process with our contracting community, what types of treatments make sense, seasons of year to get it out to the contracting community to be the most competitive. And so we want to take that, as well as a lot of research that we're doing in-house, and look at what should we do moving forward to make sure that we support the investment of these past few years. So, it's been $50 million from the general fund these past 3 years, so $150 million right there. But the department has also provided, I don't have it in front of me, that'll be in a slide, but a significant amount of investment as well. I mean, well over $250 million has been spent in the past 4 or 5 years on this program. So we need to make sure that we are preserving those roads that we touched, and that's going to probably look a little different than how we've done our selection in the past. So today's meeting, we don't really anticipate that we'll come out of this with a recommendation on exactly how we want to proceed. That's why we've already booked another meeting. What we want to do is provide more details to all of those changes that we've experienced, give some very initial draft look at what the PCI results have been from this most recent run that we did, and then talk about how do we continue to, give the public confidence in our program, not feel like we're changing, because we don't feel like we're changing what we're doing. We just don't know that saying 80 PCI average is going to yield the best, most sustainable investment to the public. And so how do we start to frame our program in a way that is sustainable in the long term? And so that's really what I wanted to say. Again, thank you for the time. We want this meeting today, to be much more conversational. That's the point of having smaller numbers. So please feel free, as any of the staff is talking about things on the screen, ask questions along the way. You don't need to hold them for our benefit. It'll be, I think, more beneficial if we do this conversationally. So, thank you.
Thank you, Captain. And I asked that goal statement be put on our agenda, which is drawn directly from this January 23rd memorandum that the county administrator sent to the board. And I think that's exactly what Catherine was talking about, that we as a subcommittee will recommend to the full committee, if there's any need to change our practice from what we've done the last 4 years. One thing you just said, though, you said the 80 PCI is or is not still our mark?
So that's what we're going to really be talking about. 80 PCI from some of the research we've been doing, and I don't want to spoil alert, that's a very high mark in terms of our research of similar agencies. And, 80 is well within very good. You could say 75 and we're still at very good. We've still achieved, and the cost of those extra 1, 2, 3 PCIs can be pretty significant. So we'll talk more about that.
Okay, very good. Anybody got anything else to start with here? If not, let's move on to agenda item 4, road selection process. Jason?
Forward, back, or over? No, not that distance. So just tell me where I gotta go, and I'll move forward. So, kind of as Catherine was saying, we want this to be conversation. So I know my name's next to a lot of items, but a lot of staff is going to interject as well as we go along. So feel free to interject any time and ask any questions as we go. So I'm sure most of us are pretty familiar with the current selection process of how we've been doing things. Currently, we have 2 different criteria categories that we use. So we have one category for local roads and then one category for arterial collector roads. Our local roadways have been worst first selection. So they get ranked on a list each year as we run our scenarios in Street Saver. We will pick the road that is next on the list, look at what subdivision it is in, and take the subdivision that it's in and do the whole subdivision together. So that's what we mean by worst first selection for local roads. For our arterial collector roadways, we've been doing a benefit cost selection in Street Saver that will rank roads based on the return on investment that we're going to get. So it's not a purely worst first for our arterial collector. And we've tweaked that as we've gone through different years. We noticed after the first couple of years that some of our collector roads weren't being chosen as much. So we've tweaked some of that to make sure that we're still getting some of those roads that are falling lower and lower and not coming up on benefit cost selection. And so out of that, we also have a specified percent of those arterial collector roads that get a seal coat. So each year, and this gets to the next bullet point, each year there's a percent split between the 2 categories that's predetermined. So this past year we've been working off a 50-50 split. So 50% of our funds go to local roads, 50% to arterial collectors. Out of that 50% that is going for the arterial collector roads, a percent of that is given for seal coat work. I think generically that's been hovering around the 5% mark. So it's a small amount that has been going to our seal coat work. As we work on these different scenarios, we use Street Saver to run different scenarios based off the 2 criteria categories that I just mentioned, and that will rank the roads. And that's how we've ranked roads, and we can pick them for the year. Each of those scenarios consider the whole network for the county, so it's not unfair to say that every road gets considered every year, which is something that we can stand behind on that. And then we will go through knowing how much money we have as we're for that fiscal year, as we're thinking about it. We pick a road, select it, pick a road, select it, until funds are allocated for that year, and that gets us to our program for that year. And so that's the high level of how the current selection process has been going. Go ahead.
So you were talking about the seal coat work. I'm wondering if you can discuss that just a little bit more with us, because you said that 5% of the roads are utilizing the seal coat work. Is that by design? It needs to be. Is it because there's only 5% of the roads that need it, or is that because only 5% of the funds are available to do the seal coat?
I would say that's a great question, and it's a little bit of both on that. So that 5% or whatever that percentage is, that's a predetermined split that we're trying to target. A lot of that is knowing that our network has been in such poor condition and getting it up there. We've been prioritizing mill and paving. So it meant that we don't want to see the roads that are good deteriorate. So we wanted to make sure we had a percent of pavement maintenance going on. But knowing that the priority was getting those poor roads up in a good condition, we wanted to make sure that there was a large amount still going to mill and pave. And we'll get more into that a little bit later, but just kind of the overview on that is the cost to do a surface treatment is significantly less than the cost to do mill and pave. So even though we're saying 5% or so, in terms of mileage, we were still doing, I think this mileage is fairly comparable for mill and pave versus surface treatment each year. So even though the cost is way different, the mileage was still fairly comparable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Thank you. Go ahead.
That's really all I've got on this slide for current selection process. I'm not sure if any staff had any input they wanted to talk about on that.
I think one thing to note is that we have not done any surface treatments to local roads as part of this program as of yet.
Yeah.
The surface treatment has been strictly for the arterial collector network.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we did, I believe the first year of the program, it was a 40-60 split where we were spending more money on locals than we were arterials. So those are decisions we've made in the committee recommendations as we adjust, as we were aiming for that target of 80. So those haven't been set in stone the whole time. And there is the funding itself doesn't preclude us from doing more surface treatments. There's no restriction in that regard.
Well, presumably that percentage is going to increase substantially as we go forward, because you'll have a lot more new pavement to try and keep in decent shape. So,
Yes.
yeah. In fact, I know a couple slides forward, we're going to talk about accomplishments, and I see miles on here. What's our current paved mileage overall?
We have 1,925 thereabouts miles of paved road.
Okay. And how's that split between locals and arterial collector?
About 1,100 of it is local miles, 825 is arterial collector.
Got it. Thank you. Anybody else? So we're going on to item 5, 10-year pavement plan accomplishments and future plans. Michelle?
Yeah.
Mostly the plan stuff.
So this table summarizes what we've been able to accomplish each of the fiscal years. Obviously, in fiscal year 2019, that was a little different. We didn't have that criteria established yet. That was kind of our building year. So during that time, we were still using cartograph information, which was our own pavement management system. We were still using the Pazer ratings, which was more of a dashboard survey. So during that 19-20 year, we established the subcommittee, we set up the criteria, we did the road audit and got the PCI, which is the paving condition index, which is a much more data-driven approach. And then we also switched to the street saver and implemented that going into our fiscal year 21 program. In fiscal year 21, as Catherine said, we started with that 40-60 split. After running analysis, we changed that split between local and arterial collector to a 66 local, 34 arterial collector. And that year we were able to, we got really good bid pricing. And so we were able to make it all the way through the list, still had some funds left over, and add additional mileage to the roads, to the original list of roads, both on the arterial and the local road side. Fiscal year 21-22 was by far our largest year. That one too, again, running the analysis, we made an adjustment in the split. That was a 58 local, 42 arterial collector split. This one had large changes in our cost during the course of the year, which we'll discuss on the next slide. And then there was also the budget that was allocated was not sufficient to cover that list, which we will also discuss later. And then in fiscal year 23, which is the one we're in right now, that one we have the 50-50 split. The prices have come down, but we're still anticipating some overages. All told, we've done really well. We made a lot of ground. So we have milled and paved about 44% of our paved roads so far. So that's a big chunk of that latent maintenance that we've been able to take care of. Next slide, please. So in fiscal 21-22, Catherine alluded to the fact that we had a lot of different challenges. A lot of it revolved around the bid cost escalation. That when we started with bids around $15 per square yard, that escalated up at one point to almost $30. So the doubling definitely affected the cost of doing and delivering the program. We were lucky enough to have the extra HERF and be able to accommodate some additional funds from our DOT budget to cover that difference and still deliver the program. But we were also fraught with a lot of other different challenges, like the asphalt shortages. There was multiple diesel price changes, cement shortages, which also affected both the curb ramp work as well as the asphalt, because we have a percentage of cement in the asphalt. So the project schedules shifted because of the shortages. We weren't able to get the ADA ramp stuff done as quickly as we had anticipated because they weren't able to get the cement in order to finish that, which then compounded our paving schedules, which caused problems with the plants and availability of asphalt. And so it was kind of a perfect storm in a lot of different ways. We had a lot of partnering with the industry to work through those issues and deliver the program, albeit late. A lot of the projects ended up pushing well past the July 1 where we had hoped to be. And then looking into the fiscal 22-23 program, we had a lot of discussions early on with ATB about how to deal with those situations, how to alleviate some of the risk on the contractor side, because obviously we had fixed pricing going in with milling and paving this past year in 22. And one of the things that when the prices escalated and the diesel fuel escalated, they were, as a contractor, having to eat a lot of that cost, which is why we saw the cost for a square yard jump so significantly, because they were having to account out for that fluctuation. So that's where this year we brought back our bituminous and our fuel adjustments to help relieve some of that risk of the contractor side, which has brought some of that pricing down. So even with those changes and the modifications that we did, we are still at about $20 a square yard. So we're not back to, our glory days. For the first 2 years, we were seeing really good pricing, but we are still a little bit elevated. Next slide, please. And so here's kind of the comparison of where we were at versus what we had budgeted.
And I'm just gonna emphasize, so the glory days was like $12, $13
It was
a
fantastic.
square yard versus $20 a square yard, which you can imagine, like, that's a huge, huge difference when you're talking about how much the area of the county that is covered by paved roads is
And what we can
significant.
get.
And what you can get done if you have that kind of increase. Yeah.
Yeah, so in fiscal year 19, we came in right on budget. They added an extra 10 million right at the end of the fiscal year that we were able to get delivered and came in right there. The next year in fiscal 2021, that one, again, we were able to add some additional pavement, and then we came in within 2 million. This past year, the fiscal 22 program, that one was $16 million over our projected budget because of all the price escalation that we saw. So that one was a hard pill to swallow, but we were able to manage and deliver on that program. And this year, even though prices have come down, we're still estimating about 7.2 million over, which we have adjusted our internal operating budgets to try and accommodate that as well. So.
Okay, we ready to talk about the future? That's the next item.
Well,
We're always ready.
that question leads in well. Good morning, folks. My name is Joe Sweet, and I'm an analyst in the analytics division, and I've been part of the research effort on these questions of when do we decide what treatments, where, and when. And so a good way to understand the basics of that is a chart. And it's more of a cartoon chart than it is hard data, but it helps us understand how the relationship, a good chart shows you a relationship, right, between, so on the horizontal axis we have years, and we have PCI on the vertical axis. So this is our relationship between how PCI changes over time. It's not linear, for a technical term there, so it accelerates as time goes on. The degradation of a road accelerates as time goes on. So that's something very important to consider. So what we have here with these dashed lines are kind of these buckets of PCI categories. So moving towards the right, you can kind of see we start at very good, and then fair, and then poor. And the idea is that as a PCI is degrading, as a road is degrading, you want to treat it with the right treatment at the right time to prevent that acceleration of decline. So you can see that in these green curves at the end of every bucket. So as you approach the end of a bucket, so let's say we're starting over there at the far left side, as you approach that first dashed line, you want to do a surface seal just before it reaches the next bucket, so that we keep it in that first bucket. We keep it in that very good condition. Everybody following me so far? Okay.
What Gabe was talking about too, in terms of public perception, is there's not much of a difference in perception in this first area up here. It's really when you start to proverbially drop off the cliff here, that's when people start really noticing that difference in PCI.
So to answer that question in more detail, you can take all your dollars and you should be very careful. So with each one of these buckets, there's kind of a critical zone right before the dashed line. And at the very last bucket, the very last group, is also a critical zone. So the failed roads, that's a problem. So the idea is to hit these roads at the right time with the right treatment. So we're not, so once again, starting from the left side going to the right, we're not going to do a surface seal right after, or we're not going to do like a fog seal right after we've milled and filled. We're going to wait until it's getting extremely close to dropping off into that next bucket. So does that kind of answer the question a little bit better? So like Catherine was saying, there is a balance between paying very close attention to, as a road network, what do we have in that critical zone, in that very poor or failed. We want to repair those, but also how are the rest of our roads declining? Are there any questions on this chart? Does this kind of make sense?
So does that mean you're maintaining two, as we move forward, you're maintaining two tracking systems? One is, what is the plan for pay-go repair roads, get where they need to be, and where watching the expiration date, if you will,
Yeah.
on how to keep those roads up at their peak level.
Yeah, so roughly, and this is kind of just an average of a degradation curve, and like Jason was saying, everybody kind of calculates it differently, and for our climate it's different than other climates, but basically that's what Street Saver does. It projects how these roads, wherever their PCI is at, it projects how they're going to decline or degrade. So we have all that data in the system, so that's all of that's a consideration.
So ideally in the future, you're not going to be having to pick which bad roads you're going to fix. The system is going to tell you got to fix these roads because their expiration date's coming up.
Exactly, because we've got 6,500 different sections to consider, so the computer's a big help with reminding us.
So it becomes, decision making is less human at that point and more, it's math.
There is some operational consideration to take into account. For example, speak to this? Okay.
Well,
So the output from the Street Saver based on our data, right, may say do this segment of the road on the west side of town and this segment of the road on the east side of town. Well, operationally, that's not necessarily feasible. It's just one small little piece. So operationally, additional roads will be taken into account. And that's partially what Jason mentioned at the beginning, where we have the worst first trigger roads currently. So some operational consideration is taken into account. So you could be, Street Saver could recommend that you mill and fill a road that's 25 PCI, for example, and right next to it there's one that's 40. It would make sense to do the one that's 40 as well together, rather than just do the one segment that's 25. So, to your question, yes, data gets us the majority of the way there, but then there are some operational considerations to take into account.
But all that's got to get done before you get to the point of that next bucket, as you call it.
ideally,
Yeah.
Ideally. The analogy that helps me with this is thinking about cars, because I think PCI and road degradation, for me anyways, is a little bit abstract. So the easiest way for me to think about it is when you buy a new car, there's going to be treatments, and you can kind of think of a car in the same way. There's going to be treatments that you need to do to maintain this car. Right? You're not going to wait on oil changes, you're not going to wait on brake replacement, you're not going to wait on tire replacement, because you're going to ruin your vehicle faster. Right? So you should get an oil, if you just got an oil change, you're not going to get another oil change right away, right? We just milled and filled, so we're not going to do a fog seal right away, but we're going to wait till it's actually time, or the mileage dictates that we should actually get a mile change, or oil change. So you can expand that idea to if you had a fleet of vehicles, as we have a road network, we have a fleet of roads. Some of those vehicles are in very poor condition, some of those vehicles are in great condition, but regardless, you're paying attention to what treatment you need to do at the right time. Is that a helpful analogy? It's helpful for me.
Yeah.
And I think to tag into that, we kind of, from the way that we're thinking about this, is that milling and paving is one option of a much larger array of treatments. So we'd be thinking of milling and paving as repair options, essentially. So each different category, there's a range of treatment options that are available to you for a certain thing. You can get to a PCI of 70 multiple different ways. Likewise, PCI 50, you know. So depending on what condition, I like to say we almost are doing like crime scene investigation with roads. We're trying to go out and forensically see how we got to this number. And that's some of the data we're getting back even to, is showing what those issues are. But at a certain point, you get low enough PCI, it's going to have to be a mill and pave at some point. And so I don't ever see the mill and pave option going away, if that answers your question. It's always going to be on the table as an option to do. But different, as we get more and more of our roads out of that bucket where mill and pave is the only option, our options for treatment widen out. Hopefully that makes sense and I didn't just confuse everyone even more.
And to expand on that, the mill and pave is, for lack of a term, the last resort, if you will. You're trying to push that out, right? We can do mill and pave and have a new road, relatively new road. But we're trying to push that out because of the costs that are associated with that. These are surface treatments that extend that life of that new asphalt. Just to give you another analogy, some good analogy, you get a new roof, right? In a 2-year mark, you want to put another seal coat on that to protect it from weather and different things. And if you don't, what's going to happen? Now you're getting into that new roof, you're patching, you're doing things like that. So you're really just protecting your investment by extending out and pushing out that mill and fill by fog seal, surface treatments, crack seal, things of that nature. Before you get to that, back to that category, well, now we got our mill and fill our road. So we're really just protecting the investment by giving it the surface treatments to push out that mill and fill category.
So just looking or continuing that discussion, so this says at year 22 or so, you're looking at minor rehab. That could go as far as mill and pave, right? If it's that bad, if it gets that bad, or are you trying to avoid that?
Potentially.
Or at least an overlay at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, in
Right.
terms of minor rehab, we're probably thinking an overlay
Right.
of some kind. If it's, and again, that's based off the conditions. So if we get to year 20 and, you know, it needs a mill and pave, we're probably down here in terms of PCI at that point.
And so I think a lot of the strategy is catching those roads before they fall down into the next bucket. So it's better to, you know, if we have roads that have just crossed over into that poor category, that we know we have to mill and pave, it's better to take that treatment to make sure that, or that those dollars to make sure that they keep the other roads at a higher PCI so that we keep them in the very good, the good, and keep resetting that PCI point up before they hit that critical point where it starts to drop off. That will stretch the dollars farther, not that we already have to mill and pave. Again, as you get down on the bottom end, things level off. So your degradation on the low end is also slows down a little bit from what you lose on a PCI perspective. So by focusing on both, getting your low PCIs or your really bad ones done, but also making sure that you're maintaining that investment, we can stretch the dollars, we can get a lot more accomplished in a sustainable fashion.
And one thing to point out is this chart is from the Utah DOT, so it's not necessarily our network. So you see that first bucket goes to 8 years, for example. For us, it could be that, it might be 6 years. So this is just a representation, just so that we're all on the same page with that.
Yeah, it's more just to understand the basics. And I think, I don't know how to emphasize your point better than you did, Michelle, but that really is the point. If you take 100% of your dollars and you start attacking roads, let's just say between 40 and 30, how do we treat the roads we've just invested in? There has to be some kind of balance. Back to the fleet of vehicles analogy, I have these vehicles in disrepair. But I also have these high-value vehicles that are brand new that I'm not going to skip oil changes and brake repairs on just so I can fix my crummy cars.
And I think the other thing is to understand the scale of the dollars. I mean, if you defer 1 mile of mill and pave, you may be able to maintain 10 or 20 miles of other road with a surface treatment. So your dollars stretch a lot farther at that upper end than they do at the lower.
And additionally to that, if you defer a surface treatment that needs to get done, that, $3 or $4 there, if you defer that long enough, all of a sudden now you're spending $10 or $12 on mill
It
pay.
accelerates.
Or
So
20, because it's a 20.
correct, yeah, 20.
So
Right now,
it's
20,
current
yeah.
pricing.
Yeah, right now, 20.
So back to the contractor question, if we can make dollars extend farther, there is more work, technically, and there's more miles being treated, which also, public perception, they're going to see more miles being treated. Of course, there will probably always be complaints about certain things, but it has some effect, regardless.
Yeah, I think Charlene's point was, how do we get to that last portion of
Yeah.
failed
Right.
and
Yeah.
poor roads?
How
that
how do we sell the program to the public? So a neighborhood that's living in a failed section, they're gonna wonder why they can't get their road approved, and you're out here sealing a fair. And I understand what you're saying, it's just trying to get that balance, but also be able to sell it to the public.
They will have that concern.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. They will have that
They've
concern.
always had that concern.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
How
You're
about,
waiting for your road to get done.
And-
Essentially road that just got paved.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm kind of with Charlene and John on this. I mean, how much is it going to cost to get the failed and the next category up? Is that another $10 million versus a straight up? We've been hearing people come in from the public say, we've been telling them, we're going to get to your worst roads. And yet we're leaving some worst roads in the program. So,
And I don't think we're
is it 10 million, is it 10 million to finish this last bottom category? So we can legitimately look the public in the eye.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good justification for $10 or $20 million more. And then we move on from there to do just what you're saying. Or maybe we do both at the same time.
I think that's a great point. I was going to suggest, I think 2 slides ahead,
Yeah,
we start to look at what are these goals, because that is what we're wrestling with. We don't want the public to have a perception. We're not worried about those few that are still failing. We very much want to address that, but we don't want to let this $200 million investment go to waste either.
Yeah, absolutely. The new fleet is really important. But I'll never forget the guy from, maybe it was Pima Mine Road saying, okay, I heard your criteria. Sounds good to me because I know you're going to fix my worst condition road. You're going to get to me eventually. And if we don't get to that eventual, that small segment, it might be 7%. Then we've got a problem with the public.
We absolutely do, and that's a way to get folks fired up.
Yeah.
That's
We'll have the lines back up again.
I love that we're already thinking about this, because like Catherine was saying, that's where we're getting to in 2 slides. So I love that you guys are already there, because that's what I want to hear, is I want to hear some of this conversation as we get there.
I also think it's, not to temper, but people don't know where the jurisdictions are either.
Yeah.
And Pima County service area is spread out and interrupted by other jurisdictions. And people are going to be complaining to Pima County about Tucson roads. And we've already had people who will run for office, continue to be politically active, riling up folks because they're driving on City of Tucson roads, but they are angry at Pima County. And I mean, yes, we need to do due diligence 100%, and we need to try to get these failed roads back up. But I also think we all should need to recognize the fact that people don't know where they're driving.
Well, they don't care. And they shouldn't.
Some
care.
don't.
When you're driving down the road, you don't care whether it's the city of Tucson, whether it's the county. You don't care what it is. You just want to be able to get through the road to wherever you're going in a safe way. When you have that, so I think there is to your point, there's a real clear difference between people who are in unincorporated Pima County and people that are in a jurisdiction. And so people who are in unincorporated Pima County, I wonder how many of those, that percentage of failed roads are in unincorporated Pima County, because that seems to be the group of people that often gets left behind and gets where the roads get fixed the last, because they're not in a
Well, I mean, the city of Tucson's got property south of the airport. Those roads are awful.
Yeah, I mean, the data we
I'm
were
asking the
showing,
question, though, do we know what percentage of the failed roads are in unincorporated Pima County versus in a jurisdiction? Is
that
that
data was just for unincorporated counties, so we're not capturing
Right.
the conditions.
It's not-
So, I completely agree with both of you. This is the challenge we face in the department. The public shouldn't have to know which jurisdiction they're in, but where we can spend our money versus where the city spends their money, or Marina or Oro Valley, those are decisions that each body's gonna make independently. And so, it's.
And I don't say my comments to be like, we're not on the right track, like, we have to get our roads out, we need to, I mean, that's a concern. I mean, that's a responsibility of local government in their responsible jurisdictions. I just want to be realistic about the fact that
It's
people, you know,
It's almost like what Charlene
this room can
said.
only deal with what this room's responsibilities are, and, it doesn't have control over everything, and we're still getting complaints.
Yeah, I think it's what Charlene said. How do we let the public know that we've made this achievement, but how do we do it without maybe inciting additional concerns and complaints? It's a balancing act, and I will say, when it comes to signal progression and some of the other elements of the transportation network, those are areas where we're working with our colleagues constantly in terms of trying to coordinate those systems because they are so interconnected. The pavement repair is very much our part's on us, their part's on them, we have very different funding mechanisms, so.
And I will say, over the past couple of years, we have made some good strides as far as partnering with the other jurisdictions wherever possible. We're partnering with Dow County on some stuff where we, is it Trico?
Trico Road.
Yeah, where we paved up to their line. They had a little bit left, and they were repaving the next cross street up, so we got them to chip in some dollars so that we could pave all the way through to give it a continuous section. The same thing with Pima Farm Road and the town of Marina. We're partnering with them to get their section done at the same time. But again, it's all dependent on whether or not that jurisdiction has the funding to be able to contribute when we're there at this.
We've been at this a little over an hour. Everybody still okay with continuing?
I want to get to
All right, let's get to the meat.
two
All right,
slides
very
from
good.
now.
Let's keep going.
Well, so just to summarize this and the narrative you're looking for, it's one word. It's critical. We're prioritizing what's critical. So that final bucket from any roads that are in PCI 20 to 0, that's critical. But also the roads that are about to fall into the next bucket, that's also critical. So I don't know if that helps exactly, but that's what we're paying attention to. We're paying attention to what is most at risk. And I know people don't intuit risk the best, but that's kind of how we're thinking about it.
By the way, I have to comment. I just noticed that, quote, good roads cost less. If you guys go back into your files from about 40 years ago, Chuck Huckleberry wrote a report once.
That said that?
It said that, exactly that. Yeah. In fact, he liked to do his own artwork. He'd do an ugly road in the front and a nice road in the back of the report, just so you know. I do remember that.
Wow.
Yeah. Very good. Let's keep going.
Yeah, so this slide at this point is going to be a little bit redundant because it just, the relationship once again between cost and time, and it depends on where in time you are. Timing's everything. So at the beginning of the chart, at the left side of the chart, the cheapest thing is to just wait around and let your roads degrade. You mill and filled a bunch of stuff and it looks good now, and you wait around. But over the long run, it's going to cost the most. Whereas, conversely, with a program strategy where we're really paying attention to each section and we're saying this road is at risk for this, and this is what's been happening to it, so this is how we should treat it. That's an important thing to keep in mind. We just had a very interesting, I'm not going to go into any of the details, but a very interesting presentation yesterday from U of A, from their pavement preservation scientist. I think his name is Tejo or Tijo? Pima. He was bringing up an example where you can mill and fill, and jurisdictions have done this, where you can mill and fill a bunch of roads, and they look at it first, but some of those roads are having the same major problems shortly after, and that's because of subgrade issues, or soil issues, or slope issues. So that's what we're, with the blue line, that's what we're trying to take into account. We're trying to take into account what roads are at risk and why are they at risk. And that's, to your point, that's not an easy narrative to, there's not a number for that, there's not a sentence for that, but I think what we're doing right now, having a dialogue about it is the key. And it probably just won't ever end. You know, we're always going to continuously have to have this open dialogue.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is there somewhat of a geotech component to some of these evaluations?
Yeah, we want to.
Okay.
Yeah, we want to. We want to have a materials lab. We want to have, U of A is actually offered to do what's called, another technical term, spectral analysis or frequency analysis, which can actually tell you the density of the soil, can tell you what you're talking about, geotech stuff. So, and that meant, like, we've been talking with ASU's pavement lab, and which is well known, and having a materials lab and checking what the contractor is doing and checking the materials can be the difference between 10 and 20 years of the service life. So,
I will say, with this current program though, with our current pavement preservation program, is mill and fill is our beefiest option at this point. So we don't have any options that do address subgrade concerns. A lot of that's when you start talking more into like a capital improvement at that point. And so that'll have to be, it's definitely in the back of our minds, especially as we start to look at, we're still at year 4 of the program. As we get closer to year 10, there's going to be some roads that are degrading faster than they should. And those, what I'm going to start calling frequent offenders, it gets more expensive to start milling and paving them every 9 years or whatever it'll end up being. And so that'll be where we have more conversations in the future about how do we address those concerns as they start to arise.
So are you saying that's one of your strategies going forward, to perhaps get into geotech evaluations before you do some work?
we recommend it.
I think, well, I'll say, it's something we need to layer in. So when we
Yeah.
started the program at the magnitude and the scale that it is, that did not seem like it was going to be a cost-effective endeavor to do sampling on every single road, and potentially rebuild the whole thing. We had learned from our friends at the city that adds a lot of time to the delivery of the program and a lot of expense. So we elected to move forward with the mill and pave as our option for the failed roads and the poor roads. But to what Jason said, we're learning a lot about our system. We can't afford to do a mill and fill every 8 years. If there's clearly some subgrade issues, we're going to have to evaluate budgeting for that. I don't think we're quite at that threshold yet, especially as we have roads we haven't touched once that are in the failed and poor condition. But once we kind of emerge from that and are continuing to create a very sustainable program, we need to layer that in.
This is something I've been thinking about for a while, by the way. On local roads, we presumably still have a lot of double chip seal roadways on ABC route there, right? You don't really do mill and fill on those, do you? Just basically, or do you milling would take off
Yeah,
a 2-inch
the term mill
double
is
chip
probably
seal.
pretty loose in some of those roads. It's probably more kick it with your boot and let it fall apart
Yeah.
and pave on top of
Yeah,
it.
they kind of
Yeah.
skim off the chip. and
Yeah.
then they-
Okay. All right, very good.
Another consideration just to keep in mind is a lot of these things that these two have been talking about, Jason and Joe, were really derived from the 80 PCI goal. To hit the 80 PCI goal, you got to do a lot more mill and fill, and ideally maintain. If that wasn't the threshold, the light at the end of the tunnel 80, then there might be some more dollars to put toward these other preventive maintenance topics.
Any questions on where we've been, where we're at?
That was really helpful doing the review, because even though many of us were here from the beginning, so hearing it again and creating the story of how we got to where we are now is a good one, so thank you for that.
I do have a question, actually. With increasing prices, you're still pursuing the same project list, but finding money elsewhere to cover the costs, rather than lowering your list, shortening your list?
Correct. This
Okay.
year we have been able to do that. That's not to say that every year we'll be able to have that same opportunity.
Yeah, and like Michelle mentioned, it really is our priority because we publish the list at the beginning of the fiscal year and everybody gets excited, residents look forward to that. So, but also to reiterate, the way we've been able to cover a lot of these overages is by sacrificing our operational budgets for our departments, which isn't ideal, but that's really what we've had to do. So even this year, conversations are ongoing about this year's pavement repairs program because of the overages. So it's unfortunate, but that's really where we are because costs have escalated so much.
And it's not going to be in the slides, but one thing to consider is, as the gas prices go up, sometimes our collections go down because those are driven off of gas sales, and people sometimes don't drive as much when it's nearly $5. So we've had some challenges in terms of revenues in the department, and so those are very much our fiscal year 22 program. We delivered every single road that was in that program. Fiscal year 23, we're still aiming for that. There are a couple projects, Erie to Mountain Road area, because it's tied to a capital project. It will move into next year because we just can't schedule-wise deliver it this fiscal year. And then our seal coats, we haven't released those contracts yet, but all of our hard bids have already gone out. So we're proceeding like we're going to deliver the rest of the program.
Now, this slide shows you coming back up in future years. Does that concern you at all? I mean, why does the pay go disappear for a few years?
Because of the advancement of those 50 million. So we got the 50 million added in fiscal year 21, 22, and 23, which means the next 4 years, we don't get any pay go. It's only department funding that's going towards the pavement program these next 4 years. So next year, it's planned at a $20 million level. Significantly different than, the 70 to 73 million we're going to spend this year, the 101 million that last year's program cost.
So is that equivalent to the year that's not on this chart on the left side? Or 23, 24, or 18?
Oh, like if we'd shown an 18-19 year,
Yeah.
I would have to go back and see what that year was. It may have been, so that would have been the year that we had the property tax contributing to the program, which was about $19 million in taxes collected, but it was distributed across all the jurisdictions, and I believe our share was in the $8.5 to $10 million range. So we had an even smaller program. I just don't recall if we had other influxes of money, but we can check on that and get back. But yes, it's more, and before that, we had years with just 5 million. We had a lot of years with 0 going towards a focused pavement program.
Now, you said you'll probably touch on this later, but this is an outlook of our 10-year program,
Yes.
where we hope by 29-30 we'd be at 80 PSI, PCI. Do you know where you're going to be given this outlook? Is that what's coming forward?
I think that's what's coming forward, and then, we also are trying to look beyond that in
Sure.
terms of what's going to be sustainable, because great if we get there in 2030, we don't want to fall off a cliff and then not be able to maintain it. So I think we're looking at a bit more of a balanced approach to it, kind of started that with the idea of the surface treatments and what percentage do we do there, and so we'll get to that. And we'll also talk about, start thinking, street saver, we can run scenarios for different planning horizons and goals we might want to achieve and see how that works out. It's a planning tool, so just like we've used it many years, and then you refine it each year based on the actuals. But start thinking about that, because we can have a discussion at the end in terms of what are scenarios that we should prepare prior to our next meeting.
You know, if we could go back to my question, it's good to see the program is sort of outlined to reach our goal. But are we falling back in the next 3 years to where we were? And if that's so, then that's something we need to know as a committee.
I agree. Yeah, that's exactly.
We really need to be comparable, because if we're going to fall back, we're going to be right back where we were before long. And the public's going to start showing up a lot more.
Hence this conversation. This is why we needed this group to get together.
Okay. But if you could give us
Yes.
the prior years, that would really be helpful for us as we're contemplating this.
But I just want to understand, Catherine, so you're saying there's, from what you know today, there's no ability to increase the next 3 years or 4 years?
That is the information I'm getting. So the entirety of the PAYGO funding that the county has allocated these past three years have gone to the transportation department. It is meant to fund capital improvements across the county. So facilities improvements, wastewater flood, there's a whole host of projects that needs to be completed. And so at some point, some of that money needs to start going to those other places, and I believe that's the intention for this coming year.
So is this a shift in focus by the Director of Administration, who is saying that perhaps facilities and wastewater projects are more important than
It's really consistent with what the memo from August of last year was, that looked through 3 different scenarios for PAYGO funding, that showed it was the most recent influx of $50 million and what that would do for funding to our program. So it was somewhat of a known funding horizon coming out. The one change that happened is the scenario that we moved forward with had this funding deficit column. I don't know that we have it readily available on a slide, but we can send it out. It had a funding deficit column which totaled around $60 million, I want to say, and we had anticipated that that would be covered by general funds. Unfortunately, because of all this inflation and interest rate changes, that funding's not there necessarily either, and so we're operating as if that funding deficit, we're not going to get the increased money. So we're matching exactly what the PAYGO column was in that scenario from last year. It's just missing this other money that we knew we would need.
But what this says is, I know you know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
I know what you're talking about. I know you guys know what you're doing, so I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying, so it isn't as if the PAYGO funds aren't available. It's that they're going to be available to somebody, but they're likely not going to be allocated to transportation.
Right.
And I guess my question is, who is it that makes that, who made that determination that was going to be the case?
It's a combination of the county administration and the finance department working through different financial horizons, and I'm sure they're having conversations with the board.
Yeah.
Now, you said you've had a lot of interaction with the industry about your programs. Now, if I was a contractor, I'd say, well, I guess I'm not going to invest in that big new piece of equipment because this program's going down. I mean, what's the contracting group saying out there about it?
So that's been an interesting conversation too. I mean, I think we've been very upfront about there was going to be a dip in our program, so they were anticipating that. I think there was anticipation that the City of Tucson's program would be ramping up by this point, but that does not seem to be materializing either. So very likely there is going to be a lull as far as the milling and paving opportunities in the general area. So I think there is a little bit of concern there about what that looks like just in general. So.
And obviously, just to carry it a step further, the RTA next, as you know, is discussing whether to have these kind of dollars, payment replacement and repair dollars in it. So you've not assumed any of that, obviously, because I don't see any money.
That's correct.
Okay. Which could come, presumably, as you know, but
Yes.
It's not there yet. Right? So, anybody else?
Well, it's kind of like everybody was in the ballroom doing Happy Days Are Here again. Now, they don't want to dance anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. All right, thank you. We still on item 5, or we moving forward?
We are moving on to
All right,
PCI.
let's go to 6.
All right. There's that one column in there.
Then Ellen.
It's an outline, yeah. Okay, so just some high level, kind of where we expected to be at this point. So with our Street Saver program, it automatically will calculate degradations and all that fun stuff. So as it's been projecting stuff, as well as going off that original 2019 PCI data, that's where we're getting these numbers from. So just put that in mind. We're going to talk about some of the preliminary information we're getting back from this year's run in a little bit. So where we expected to be at this very moment was an overall network PCI of 69, with a remaining service life of about 20 years for our whole network. Street Saver breaks it down into different classes, just kind of a bullet point. All of these right here are considered arterial collector, and there's our local roads, just that one bar chart, one bar right there. So kind of the overall thought, and this one's kind of missing, but it's kind of there. You can see all of them are doing pretty similar. All the categories are between 65 and 84. And just for your information, the other category we have on there, that is our urban arterial roads. So we just, Street Saver kind of predefined the categories. We can't go in and edit the category name, otherwise I think we would have. So that's what that column is. So the scenario run that we do at the beginning of the year groups all of these into arterial collector, uses that criteria we talked about earlier, and then that uses the local criteria. Our local roads, the average is a 71 right now, and then our arterial collector average puts us at about a 67 for our arterial collector roads. And again, this is where we expected to be at this point. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Gilbert.
I'll just point out, I mean, that is in the good range. So we have made it into good. We're not in poor or failed as our average network condition. That is an accomplishment unto itself.
Yeah, and piggybacking off where Catherine was, kind of saying, this is a different way of kind of doing that. This is our whole network total. So the percent of roads we have is very good, which that PCI of 70 and above is we have 51% of our network that is PCI 70 and above at this point. The good category, which is 50 to 70 PCI, we have 26%, and that's reflected by this blue and yellow. That's that guy right in here. We still have 20% of our roads in poor, which is PCI 25 to 50, and then there's just shy of 2% in that very poor, which is this little red pie slice right there, and that's PCI under 25. So just looking at the pie chart, we can see we have over half our network is above a PCI of 70 already at this point, and that's, I think, very reflective of the monies and the effort that's been put in the first 4 years of this program. Go ahead, Gilbert. So now, getting to the point where I know a lot of us are excited about. So here's some of the preliminary data that we're getting back from our survey this year. And again, this is very preliminary, early draft data. And I say that just to kind of curb a little bit of expectations, I guess. We're still ongoing with the company, even doing QC and QA on these results. seeing so far. Another thing to mention is this information here on this chart and the one that's going to follow on the next slide is from this company. And just, I don't want to bore anyone with some data, but PCI, the way that PCI is calculated is based off different curves. There's no set formula for these curves. So every group, every organization that will calculate PCI, so Street Saver, RAS, etc., they all interpret that curve slightly differently. So their results will be pretty similar, but there will be a little variation in how they calculate it. So some of the data we're going to show you, again, it's preliminary from them. It's not been inputted into our system yet, so we don't have an exact apples-to-apples comparison of where the data actually is versus what we expected. But just from this slide, I wanted to point out, even from their run, based off their PCI, you can see that very good category we talked about from Street Saver from 70 and above. That would be both of these columns together. So you can see that where we expected to be with this large amount of roads in good condition, in very good condition, is kind of what we're seeing from our run. So we're reflecting the real world results of having a lot of roads in good condition. So that was a good, a positive encouragement for us, is that where we expected to be is kind of where we're seeing those results come back to be. It also is showing that we do still have some work to be done, though. So there are still a good chunk of roads that are in that poor to serious range. So we do have work to be done, but we have a good reflection of a lot of the effort that we put in. Go over. So a different way to break that down a little bit, looking at the percentages here. So again, this would be, these two columns here are pretty well equivalent to what Street Saver would call very good, which is 70 and above. And you can see that reflected, that, the total percent there is about what we were thinking, maybe even a little better than what we were expecting. Again, we're very early in looking at this, having them review the data as well. So I'm going to give cautious optimism for everyone. The average they gave us was a 74.9. So, again, PCI can be calculated slightly different. So I'm not saying that our network is 74.9 at this time, but the early results show that we might be better than what we expected it to be at this point. So cautious optimism there. I see glances. You feel free to jump in.
I think cautious optimism is the right phrase. I mean, we were very excited when we saw this come in, but we need to do our QC. But I mean, this is what we were working for. So I mean, I do think we have to acknowledge there is a lot of success in what we've done thus far.
So I have a question. What is your QC process for this?
Do you want to talk about it, Jason and Joe? Because you've been more
Yeah,
boots on the ground with it.
A lot of what we've been doing from a QA standpoint, I can't speak to what RAS would do from a QC standpoint. I know a lot of what they're going to start doing is looking at the data we had in Street Saver and kind of comparing and going, okay, so we see a discrepancy, let's look at it more and go, why? Let's try to explain it. From a QA standpoint, we've been doing something fairly similar. So we have their data, and I can't speak for Joe too much, but the past week or two, I've just been staring at my screen, comparing stuff back and forth, looking at the spreadsheets, looking at stuff, and trying to make sense of it. And we've been going through and writing places where we have questions, where we're looking at something going, okay, guys, explain this to us. Why is your data showing this? And so a lot of that process is been a visual comparison of the data, and some of it I expect very easy explanations for, and others they're going to have a little more. I'm sure they've got a reason behind it, but that's what we're going to be asking them for is explain the data to us where we're seeing some of these areas of concerns.
So a lot of it is comparing what the projected PCI is coming out of Street Saver with what they projected in the field, or what they calculated from the field observations, and seeing if there was a big discrepancy between the two. We expect them not to match exactly, but if there's big swings one way or the other, we want to dig into that and see which one is more accurate.
Now, are we reviewing the entire network or not, or some portion of it, or the whole network? Okay. And it's in progress or in process or done? Or
So all of the data collection has been done, and now we're on to the QC/QA portion.
Gotcha.
And part of it is, our vendors are RES. We let them know the roads that are in our program this year because there could be active construction when they were out collecting the data. There could be utility work going on that's not driven by us. There's a lot of different things that in that moment in time when their van was going through could have caused some anomalies. So that's part of what the QC has also looked at, is they're saying a road was barricaded off and we have to go back and say, was it for a project that we're doing that then we can just reset it to 100 or some other PCI, or is it because of some other reason?
Now, we're saying the network average is almost 75. Where did we start 4 years ago, more or less?
55.
55?
And that was when we got our first PCI run, because when we were doing it off Pacer, we thought it was even less than that.
Really? Okay.
We had a big jump when we went from the windshield Pacer type evaluation, which I think was around 42, 40-ish initially, and then when we got the first PCI run, it kind of upped it. But we also evaluated all of the decision tree in terms of treatments and what those kind of grade points are when you go to a mill and pave versus a surface treatment with those results.
Well, I was going to get to this later, and I'll probably repeat it anyway, but that's a very significant improvement, obviously, and I just don't know how much Pima County has promoted itself as to how much good work's been done in the last 4 years, quite honestly. And I don't know whether that's a conversation you all have internally at all about that kind of publicity or not.
You know, they're in my view as a resident, things that I hear, they're in a tough position. Oh, we're so great, look what we did. Well, yeah, that's what you're supposed to be doing the whole time.
Understand. No, we didn't, and now we are.
So you'll look crazy. You guys know what I mean.
Yeah, gotcha.
But I think it could be spun that Pima County is making an effort to improve their roadways. So if they did go out and this is the program we have implemented since 2018, and we feel that at this time it's done a really good job. And as far as, so if you only have, speaking from my perspective, if you only have, say, 20% or maybe 21% of the roads that are rated as poor and below, then I think something we need to look at is how much does it really take to try to bring up those roads, correct? Before we start talking about maintenance. Is that what the process is
Yes,
going to be?
but I will say, I caution you because, we may have the 20% that is poor and below, but you get that fair at 17%. You don't want, what if 5% of that's at the tipping point? You're constantly going to be filling the poor category and the failed category. We want to make sure that we're keeping all of those that are above that line permanent, because it's so much cheaper, like we said. The seal coat's so much less expensive than the mill and pave, so we need to balance that kind of tipping point.
What is a reason? I'm sorry, you finished. Okay. What is a normal amount of poor roads that a city or county our size typically has? Have you guys done any research on that?
That's a great question. I know Maricopa County. Remind me what their goal is.
Goal is 5% of roads under a PCI of 40, and 60% of roads over a PCI of 60. And so they're not necessarily approaching it the way we have historically in this current program by shooting for an 80 PCI, because as the gentleman will speak to in a bit, it's and Catherine's mentioned, it's so much more expensive to Millfield Road. And perception of the public driving on an 80 versus 70, for example, not much difference. You would only really begin to see a difference from like an 80 to like a 60 or 55 or 50. A 10% PCI, especially at the higher levels, there's not a real noticeable difference. It's the lower PCI levels, a 30 to a 20, you can definitely tell the difference there. It's not as stark a contrast at the higher PCI levels. So they approach it a little bit differently than we do, trying to keep everything above that in a good perceptive driving condition rather than shoot for 80 the way we have, which this state could considerable amount of dollars to maintain.
So then what do other agencies, what PCI do they typically try to manage?
Well, I mentioned MCDOT, which has a similar network in size. They're a little bit bigger, about 2,700 miles. We're about, just around 2,000, or just shy of 2,000. They don't go for a target. They're looking for a percentage of roads above 60 and keeping a percentage of roads out of below 40. That's their approach.
A lot?
I can tell you that the dollars that they are putting towards their program pale in comparison to the budgets that we've had in our program.
You say they pale in comparison?
Oh, I'm sorry. No,
They go the other way.
Yeah, they're much cheaper to deliver that program.
Yeah, I mean, they were looking at a $13 to $15 million a year pavement. That's kind of what they're targeting in the long term for their network. I mean, that's
And those are dollars that can go to other.
completely different scale for an agency that gets about twice as much per BLT as we do.
Yeah, in fact, I'm surprised they've got that much mileage. I didn't realize. I thought
Yeah, we were
unincorporated
surprised.
Maricopa
We
County.
were surprised, but, what was interesting is when we met with the staff, they said keeping the 75% above 60 is actually kind of easy, but keeping, no more than 5% below 40 is really, really challenging. So I thought that was interesting, with that spread, and they just said, but I do think one thing that we have noticed from some of the research we've done is that, a sustainable network maintenance program will always have roads in failed status. It's just managing an acceptable level. But yeah, I thought it was interesting. They said their challenge is keeping, no more than 5% below 40. So.
What you'll find in the literature from the more famous DOTs is that they just get a limited budget. It's like, here you go, here's your budget. And so what they're attempting to do typically is figure out how far they can make those dollars go. So they don't typically have like an 80 PCI target or anything like that. It's just like, here's the most you'll get. Make it work. Make it work.
Well, have they also pretty much had a roads program throughout, whereas we really haven't?
That's a very good point. We've
Yeah.
had quite a bit of our network,
Yeah.
low category, lower PCIs to begin.
So you talked about the high and the low here. Anything about the preventative strategy we want to know about?
Well, so the preventative strategy is, it's just not necessarily taking into account all of these details as to, a preventive strategy could be just worst first, mill and fill, but it doesn't necessarily address these issues of why these roads were failing in the first place, or why they're, like Jason mentioned, frequent offenders?
Yeah.
Why certain roads are lasting longer, why certain roads aren't. So the programmed approach kind of takes into account all of these variables that matter the most, if that kind of makes sense. Once again, not an easy narrative, but...
Yeah, I think the preventative strategy basically says, every X years we're going to do a treatment. It doesn't consider into effect what that segment of road specifically needs. So you could say, every 5 years we're going to 8 years out of a micro, whereas another road you might only get 4. And so I think that's the difference between the program and preventative. The program looks a little bit deeper and goes, all right, this segment here, what are we seeing on this road? Maybe it only needs a micro every 8 years instead of every 6. Whereas this one over here, maybe that needs it every 4. Just depending on the condition that we're seeing with the road.
And that kind of that goes back to John's question. He's not here, but he was kind of saying something like, so basically the computer's telling you guys what to do. Not necessarily, because Jason often has to go out and, because the computer's making certain assumptions. And so Jason will have to go out and say, does that really make sense for this section or for this part of the network? So there is this human element of making sure we're taking into account the variables that Street Saver doesn't take into account.
I think we can go to the next slide.
Okay.
We're already starting to hit those points on that next slide. There's a lot of stuff on this slide, so I want to make sure we have time to kind of read through it and discuss it. I think this is really where our launching point is for a lot of the discussion that it sounds like we're all ready to have. So on this slide, just kind of a description of what we've got. On the left side is it's a pros and cons list of what we are currently doing. On the right side is kind of a pros and cons of where we would, what we're seeing with this best practices approach and all the research that we've been talking about. And so feel free to jump in on this.
Okay.
So with our current criteria, the pros, we've talked already a lot about this, is it means that we're getting our local roads out of failed category very quickly. We're only 4 years in to this program, and we've already talked about how that PCI has, jumped up significantly in 4 years from the investment we put in. Additionally, we're 4 years in, and so the public has kind of gotten into an understanding of what our program is doing at this point. There's pretty good expectation and perception of how the program is working, I think, at this point. The cons, as we've talked about, very expensive. You can see from those first 4 years of the program, we have spent a lot of money on roads. Additionally, we're kind of limited in terms of the network consideration because we're getting, all right, here's this segment, here's this segment, here's this one. We've tweaked it a little to balance that out, like Gabe was talking about, with a little bit of the human element of logistics, just going, it doesn't make sense to package road here, the road on the other side of the county in the same spot. With the volume that we've been doing, we've been able to package stuff pretty well, but as we lower our dollar amount, that's where we're really going to start seeing that discrepancy of random segments on opposite sides of the county, and there's not much to package together. So I think as our dollars amount that we're spending each year decreases, that's where we're really going to start running into that wall of random segments popping up across the county that don't have anything adjacent to them that makes sense to go out and package together. It's also very reactive to conditions. So we've talked a lot about, it reaches this PCI, now we can mill and pave it, or vice versa. So our program has been catching up, and we can all be realistic. We've had to, because of where we started. So we list that as a con, but it's a necessity of a con at this point. Additionally, we've not really thought about remaining service life because, again, we're just trying to get everything out of that failed category. In terms of the best practices approach, what we've been talking about with that programmed strategy, it really does consider holistic to the network. So we can stand behind it and go, all right, how do we look at the entire network and make sure that we're doing stuff that makes sense at the right time? It's proactive and preventative, and also budget friendly. So we've talked about how we're going to have less dollars, and using stuff at the right time, doing it at the right time is a little more fiscally advantageous than the current approach. And it also will maximize the service life of our network. So we talked about, right now we're expecting about 20 years out of the whole network. That's pretty good. We'd like to keep it to where we're expecting our roads to last even longer than that, ideally. And doing things at the right time would help with that as well. The cons are, and we've already kind of hinted at this a little bit through the discussion you guys have brought up, is that some of those local roads that are least traveled, they might need to wait a little longer to get repaired than the current approach. Additionally, any new approach that we take is going to have to be explained to the public. And we've already talked about how that could be difficult to try to explain to the public this perception of why are the newer roads getting touched again when my bad road hasn't been touched yet. And so there's some difficulty to the public perception on that.
Well, there's political expediency, right? There's this idea that we fix everything now, and that rhetoric sounds great, but what about the consideration of greater lengths of time? We do have to think about that time is always coming up, so it can be politically expedient to inject as many dollars as we can to just mill and fill things, and that'll look good at first, but the point of that earlier chart was as time goes on, that gets more and more expensive and is less and less sustainable.
So it was brought up earlier with the funding that we have scheduled for the rest of this 10-year program. Will we hit 80 PCI? So I can rip the Band-Aid off and say no, we won't. Now, some of that is, again, with the new PCI data we got, that doesn't factor into that yet. When we crunch these numbers, that new PCI data hasn't come in yet. So basing off where we thought we were going to be at a 69, which we might be a little bit better, again, it depends on how that data shakes out as we go through the QA process. But assuming that we're going off that 69, at the end of our 10-year program, we'd be hitting 75 with the dollars that we have allocated and using the current criteria that we've been using.
What dollars do you need to get that last 5%?
You have that table up still, Gabe?
So we had an anticipated budget, and sorry, let me scroll down here. So we roughly have 327 million to get 75. We believe we get 75 with. To hit 80, it would be 447 million.
So 120?
Yeah, pretty big difference there over time. Roughly to hit 80, we should be spending, according to Street Saver, right around $50 million a year, every year, up to 2030 to hit 80. We have roughly 20 next year, 32 the year after that, 34 after that. By the end of the program, we get back up to 72 million in the last 2 years of the program. I have a lot of different. We get to 59 million in the second to last year of the program, and 62 million in the last year of the program. But before that, we're right around between 20 and 30 million, $34 million a year, just roughly speaking. So that's quite a big difference from the 50, roughly 50, 55 that we should be spending if we're going to hit 80, based on the current program and how we've been progressing along. And those are dollars, that I'm sure Matt would like to spend some of those dollars on other of our asset categories. To this point, we've really just been focusing on pavement, but I'm sure Matt can tell you that those dollars would go quite a bit elsewhere in our asset classes as well.
I can say every other department in the county is, they would love if I stopped spending all their money. So.
Well, they think, 75 to 80. they're both very good pavement conditions.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about, is do we want to be
Are we
very,
happy
very
with
good?
75?
Yeah, are we happy with 75? Are there other ways, I mean, what I've heard and written down and taken note of is the question of how much is it gonna cost to do those remaining failed roads? We don't wanna leave anybody behind. So I think that's the takeaway that we need to really get that estimate for that discrete bit of work.
So we don't know what the average PCI rating would be if we took the other approach and fixed the failed roads. What would the overall PCI rating at the end of the 10 years?
Well, we're intending, the current plan is to touch those roads as currently seen fit. It's really what the 80 PCI target is. We're going to fix it, but then we have to also maintain 80. So we have to balance that out. If we had 70 as a target, for example, same thing. The roads are still, those roads in disrepair would still be mill and filled and be brought up to a condition. But then we maintaining that gap of 10 PCI points allows us to stretch the dollars a lot further. So it's not to say that those roads are not going to get touched and be taken care of. It's more of how much money are we going to throw to keep 80 PCI is one of the considerations to take into account.
So,
Isn't it a matter of timing? Because you're saying that the roads, the people that live in those roads, that 5% in disrepair would have to wait a little longer, to find a little longer.
So that's
That would be
generically
next slide,
speaking.
too.
Yeah, okay, so, well, before,
Yeah.
that's generically speaking, right? A programmed approach generally acknowledges that some roads will be in that disrepair, lower quality ratings, right? That's not to say that the ones that are there today will still be there by the end of this program. It's to say that, the remaining time of the current program and then beyond, by that approach, you would have some percentage in that category. And that category, as McDOT has done, is 40, right? The ones on this, according to the Street Savers recommend, numbers are PCI under 25 are the failed and serious categories, right? So the ones that have 40 are 10% roughly. So we could maintain that higher level of 25 to 40 PCI and still take care of the failed and serious as well. It's really the higher end. What are we doing to maintain the higher end so that in a holistic manner rather than only shooting for 80 PCI?
Well, something to consider with 80 PCI, just understanding averages, we're averaging out 6,500 different sections. There's different ways to get to an average of 80, right? So we could still have an average of 80 with a high percentage of failed roads, or higher than we want. So, and what I'm kind of gathering in general from this conversation is there's more of a concern on what's failed. So maybe that's the approach to the narrative as opposed to, I can have a huge group in super great condition, but also a huge group in pretty bad condition, and the average would still be in the middle. So the average wouldn't really describe my condition as a whole, but maybe the biggest concern is how many are failed. So maybe the question, as opposed to an average of 80, is can we get to a place where we prioritize failed roads and we try to have as little, maybe 0% failed roads moving forward?
Why don't you take us to the next slide?
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gonna
I was
say, go to
saying,
the
we're
next
right
slide,
there.
because
Yeah.
what I'm hearing is time limit for sections to remain in
In that
failed or
failed
poor condition. We don't want people to be indefinitely in there.
Right.
Right.
A year, 2 years, what are we talking about, right? In order to feel like we're being good stewards of everybody's.
One question I have, okay, so we were trying to reach a goal of 80 PCI, but what is making, right now I hear your concern is that that's quite high. So for this subcommittee, is our goal also to look at maybe lowering that so we can accomplish more of getting these roads upgraded?
Yes.
Is that the overall?
I think it's how do we reframe
Yes, yeah.
how we describe this program,
Yes.
which is still going to be a very effective program, we're going to be doing a lot of work, but how do we get away from saying 80 is our measure of success, and
Right.
talking in more words really about what we're trying to achieve for the public. So talking about not letting things stay in failed condition, or, you know, I think the MCDOT, we keep going back to it, having that kind of expression of, we want this percentage of our roads in very good,
Yes.
and we want this teeny tiny percentage in failed. That's success, but it's not articulated as 80 PCI.
Right.
Yeah.
Why don't you take us through the recommendations?
All right, so based off the research that we have been doing, and even kind of thinking through some of the concerns that we might be getting, some of the recommendations that we have for this group to discuss and ultimately to kick around, kind of, they all fall into these three major categories that are in bold. So first, right timing for the right treatment. And really, that looks at what is going to be the most effective for a certain section. Case in point, a fog seal. We will hear a lot of times, oh, you're just painting the road black. If you're doing it at the wrong time, you are just painting the road black. But if you're doing it within that first, realistically between year 1 and year 3 of the road being paved, a fog seal is still effective. It's more of a good way to describe it is it's a sunscreen. So you're basically rejuvenating that road, putting some oil back into it.
Moisturizing.
Moisturizing it, yeah, I like it. It's moisturizing.
Who said that?
That's really what it is.
You know, moisturize it.
I like
I'm a pasty white guy. Not moisturized.
We all live in some area, we all know how dry it is. Like, you feel your skin get really dry if it's not moisturized. The roads are the same way.
Say that to a bunch of engineers.
Hey, I love that analogy.
You all can remember it.
That's the one that always gets to get this humor.
So yeah, that's exactly right. But really, once those fine aggregates start to disappear off the road, fog seal is no longer effective because you're painting your rocks black and you're not going to do anything to it. So that's just an example of the right treatment for the right time. After 3 or 4 years of a road being out there, you can guess that you're probably going to have to start moving into a slurry or a micro or something that's going to have some fine aggregates back in it. So that's just kind of the generics of what we're talking about there. Which I just want to say right now to remind everyone, our local roads, we don't have an option to do surface treatments on our local roads. And so that's really what that bullet point is talking to, is making sure that we're catching up with those as needed. Into bullet point number 2 then, maintain investment versus deferring maintenance. So it's really looking at this, protecting and prioritizing our investments. We've talked about how much money we've put into this program already. The last thing I think anyone wants to do is to say we put all this money in and now we're not going to touch it again and we're just going to let it all degrade and disappear. So it's making sure we're maintaining the investment we've put in while also making sure that we're not deferring stuff forever and ever and ever. Which gets into the next point, holistic consideration for the network. And this is, I think, really where a lot of our discussion wants to be, is looking at like a cap limit for percent of failed and poor. So really taking what MCDOT was doing and kind of applying it to our setting and going, what do we think is acceptable for the amount of our network to be planned for? What percentage do we think is reasonable to have? Because realistically, roads are going to continue to degrade over time. So the minute you get them all out of failed and poor, another one's waiting to come in that category. So what is our balance there? Time limit for sections to remain in failed or poor, recognizing that if we're doing a benefit cost analysis, something that is in a very rural area might not come up on a benefit cost analysis because there's only 10 cars a day driving it. It's recognizing that, hey, we don't want that section to stay in failed and poor for longer than X amount of time, because we don't want to forget about anyone in Pima County. You know, no one should have their road remain failed and poor longer than X period of time. If we can get to it before that, great, we want to get to it before that. But if not, what's our set goal on when it has to be done and out of that category? Strategic planning, so as we are thinking, a lot of questions we get always comes down to, when is my road going to be done? With the current scenario that we've been doing, my honest answer in my head is always, I don't know. We could say it'll get done in the 10-year program, but I can't give a specific on what window we're looking at for it. Worst first helps out a little bit, but again, the way we do our criteria doesn't get us the flexibility to be able to tell constituents, your road is probably going to get hit in this window. Even as we look at this new kind of way of thinking about things and making sure we're doing this, benefit cost for everything, we're still not going to be able to give exact answers. So that's not the goal of that. We want to be able to give some flexibility for staff as we look at that. But it will help us to know further out than 1 year of, hey, what might be on the horizon coming up? And we can start thinking about, knowing the budget we have for certain years, does it need to happen a year early, a year late, to make sure that we don't get out of those first two bullet points in this category of cap limit for percent and time limit. And then consideration of public perception and concerns, that's a big deal. We need to make sure that whatever approach that we're taking has the ability and flexibility to hear the concerns of the public and not be so rigid that we are looking like we don't care about what the public is saying. So I've said a lot, but really I'm just trying to kind of whet everyone's appetite a little bit for discussion. So what are your thoughts on this? Joe, I don't know if you had any more before I throw it open to everyone.
Well, actually, let me ask the group here. I mean, we've had a good deal of discussion, very good discussion, and perhaps this is the point where we sit back and digest these recommendations for our next meeting.
I would say that's the
I don't
case.
think that we need to continue this today necessarily. If somebody has. You good?
Are there any specific scenarios off the top of your head that you'd like us to have that data ready for the next meeting? I mean, that's a big question.
Well,
But it'll be
you would
easier for
understand.
us to have a productive conversation.
I would like to be able to understand a little bit more. I'm hearing X amount of years, you need to wait a little longer, let's define
Yeah.
that,
Okay.
about what that really specifically looks like. Or not specifically,
Like some proposals of
Yeah.
how we might be
Right.
able to frame it that
Right.
you guys can then kind
Right.
of
play around.
discuss specifics.
Well, let me ask about the overall budget, because, I mean, I see that you're saying, yeah, in future years, we'll maybe only devote 20 million to this, which is a lot still.
Yeah.
And how does that factor into your planning for capital improvements and the county having addressed those at some point?
That's a really good question. I mean, we have a very small capital program right
Right.
now, mostly due to the fact that our projects in the RTA were front-loaded, we're done with those, and we don't receive enough money in HERP and DLT to fund large-scale capital improvements just with the revenues we get. So
Right.
our focus has been completely on this program.
Exactly.
I think as we see what happens with RTA next, it's going to become a lot more critical how we program that funding and what long-term we can commit to the program. But I don't know that yet. I mean, that's yet to see.
So when you laid out the budget, this longer range budget, you just said, this is what I need for this part of the program, but I don't know what that means for anything else.
I did ask the team to look at beyond this. If we went another 10 years beyond this, how much money a year are we talking about? If we did $20 million a year, what PCR are we going to stick with? If we did 30 million, if we did 40 million. So we do have some of that it was using, I believe, still the approach that we had been, though, worst first for locals. I think we might do better, is what I'm hoping, if we do this more holistic, sustainable approach. 20 million will go much further if we're not using mill and fill as our one and only option for locals, which we probably shouldn't be. That was a very appropriate choice that we made at the beginning of this program, given that 60% of our network was failed and poor, primarily in our local roads. So that was the right choice at that time. But we need to continue to refine that. But I mean, right now, the investment to this program is meaning that we're not addressing all of our other right-of-way concerns, essentially. Every other maintenance. This is not the only thing in the right-of-way we maintain. We have sidewalks, we have guardrails, we have bridges, we have, you name it. So we need to start investing on those as well.
I do have a question. Just what is that dollar amount sweet spot? I mean, obviously you can't look into the future, see how costs change. But let's say all of our roads are in the 80% range. What is the cost to maintain year over year?
At that.
And can you do it at the 20 million or whatever it is? Because obviously you do have until somebody decides to change our infrastructure investment model up at the state. This is what we've got. So what is that lucky
To maintain an 80 PCI?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, let's say you get all of the roads and stuff, everything finally done, everything's up. What does it cost to maintain?
roughly $50 to $55 million.
How much?
$50 to $55 million. A year.
Oh,
80 is difficult.
80 is very difficult.
That's not
very
gonna
difficult to maintain in the future.
So we just found that.
That's the conversation that we were hinting at, is the higher up you get your PCI average, the more money it's gonna cost to maintain. So even though from 75 to 80 is only 5 percentage points, getting that jump is gonna be a lot more money.
So what does it cost at 75?
We didn't do a projection for 75 specifically. What we looked at was maybe what sustainable budgets could potentially be possible beyond 2030. And so we looked at 20, 30, 40 $million a year. None of those, even the $40 million a year didn't keep us obviously at 80. There's a fluctuation because you have the different segments degrading at different rates and whatnot. So it's not necessarily a flat line for every year off into the future. There's a little bit of give and take. Anything short of really around $50 million, there's some sort of degradation. It just at what rate are you degrading at if your goal is 80?
Right. So what is it? What is the dollar amount if there's a big jump between 75 and 80? What's the 75?
But that I don't have. That I don't.
That's a
It's
scenario
probably.
for next time.
Okay.
That's what I want to hear. What are
Okay.
the things that'll help you kind of
Yeah.
baseline and frame out recommendations you might make? And I always like to remind, so 50 million. This year's budget, we get $55 million from HERF from the state and 19 of BLT, just to give you a little bit of grounding on what the revenue source for the entire department is. So 50 million would not be a sustainable thing. It increases year over year, but slowly.
So is it possible also, I know you looked at, was it McDOT's
Yes.
program? Is it also possible to maybe look at a couple of other programs that we can look at and maybe compare ourselves to, you know what I mean? Because, yeah, McDOT sounds good, but what are other agencies using besides, trying to maintain a PCI of 80 that has been successful in at least maintaining a certain PCI other than 80?
We can certainly do that. One thing to keep in mind is the climate, and I pointed that out on the Utah DOT slide earlier. They have a much different climate, so their degradation of their pavement
Right.
and asphalt is going to happen at a different rate. McDOT is of similar size in the same climate, right? Very, very similar to us, so they're a good, they're a useful comparison for that perspective, right?
Well, I'm not saying they're not great, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, I
Like,
know.
if we looked at Las Vegas, if we looked at
Yeah, okay.
some other desert.
But it would help us to justify reframing our program, that's all I'm saying.
very good. I think we've had an excellent, yes, sir, go ahead.
I'm just reflecting back, there are two things we talked about. how much is it gonna cost to do just the bottom to fail? How much is that gonna be? So we need, and the prior history, so we can see this chart expanded a little bit to show us what it was that put us in this position in the past, but we just haven't reflected on it. And last, I have a question, which you may or may not have an answer for, but some jurisdictions have what I call capital improvement plan, where you see the sewage, the water, the utilities. So when you redo a road, you wait a year or two until those utilities are done. If you drive along Ironwood Hill Drive, you can see it's been chunked up here and there, but it wasn't done that long ago. And the same on Silverbill. They're doing chunks, and that doesn't help the ride either. So are you doing that? I know some jurisdictions do that.
Do we have a 5-year moratorium?
Yeah, right, where you, okay, we know we need to do this road, it's ready, but we're gonna wait a year because the county's gonna go in and redo the sewage.
So I will say that's
Septic.
been part of the struggle with the way we've been doing our current program is, I mean, even internally, we don't know what road is gonna be done the next year. And so that is one of the struggles that we have, is looking region-wide and going, what do the utilities have for their projects? What do, this year we started having more conversations with the utilities on that. A lot of them, kind of for that reason, we've paved so many miles that they're running a moratorium left and right. And they're going, okay, we need to talk to Pima County and make sure that we're on the same page of what's happening. So some of that dialogue is starting to happen now, and we've seen a lot better results this year from a lot of the utilities, making sure that we're able to at least have their projects done prior to us getting in, which will save them money and provide a better product for the public because the road's not cut up. And hopefully that process will continue to get refined as we move forward. But certainly being able to have more of an outlook beyond just 1 year would help with that as well.
Yeah, so that has been some of the struggle is we come out with our list in May that we publish, and then we, disseminate that information to the different utilities. But by that point, their improvement projects are already in the works too, but they haven't shared their list with us necessarily. Or it's projected out. And the other challenge is, even though we have moratoriums on all these roads, that doesn't mean that we prevent them from doing the work that they need to do. They are still allowed to cut the road, we just have them, do a better or more improved patch. But it is still a patch in the section of the road and how it comes in.
Anybody else? March 14th, next meeting, or is it?
March 7th.
7th.
Meanwhile, if you guys have any other scenarios or any questions, please email me and then I can distribute it out, just because we don't want to violate any open meeting laws.
Understand, but it is 7, you've
It
got
is
14 on here, but it is 7.
My apologies.
No problem. Okay, I had it down on my calendar as 7, so I'm glad.
Yeah.
That sounds good. Well, I will tell you, you started off, Catherine, was saying, you've learned a lot. Well, I think this conversation is thinking back about how this group started discussing it. This is a lot more in-depth, a lot more, you all have learned some lessons, we've learned some lessons. I think this is an excellent recommendation to consider, but I think we've got some details that we are interested in hearing from you next time we get together.
Yeah.
So, unless anybody's got anything else, I think we are adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Can we get a formal vote for adjournment, just for the record? I'm sorry.
I move that we adjourn the meeting.
Thank you. And there's a second?
All those in favor?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Come on. That is RTA.